Okay, thanks for attending, everybody. We already had a question, so if you look at your controls there, you can type in a question or a chat, and let me get the list of attendees up. And I welcome comments as we go along. So if, I'm actually going to encourage it later. So if you raise your hand, you see your hand on the controls there, I'll unmute you. You may have to enter in a PIN number, and then would look forward to your comment or question. Okay, let's get into it here. As you know, in FY18, FPDS&G implemented a new data field, 6T, inherently governmental functions, and it replaces the coding that used to go in the contract description field. So let's take a look at FPDS&G, and we'll look at the latest data dictionary. So if I go to https://fpds.gov, click on Work Site, scroll down to version 1.5 data dictionary. That's the latest one. Click on that. That's going to give me a PDF. And we'll look for 6T, which is just the alphanumeric identification of the new field. Here it is. Here are the governmental functions. I'm going to click on that. And a couple key points in the data dictionary is that it is required for action signed later than this date, 03/01/2012, and have a PSC code that designates a service. So it begins with a letter. So that's what they're requiring it to be entered into. Delivery orders required, purchase orders. You got to enter in this field. That is, pick from one of these four values, which we'll get into. Now, you cannot put it in for a federal supply schedule or a GWAC, but for everything else, you got to put it in. And the other thing, while we're at the data dictionary, that is a big part of why we're having this webinar, is that if you look at the description of the codes, CL stands for closely associated. Well, what's the long definition of it? What's the in-depth definition? Well, it's the same as the short definition. So not very helpful. There might be a reason why FPDS&G did that, as we'll see, but you know, for any other field, they will give you here, you know, just for example, the National Interest Action Codes, California wildfires, they'll give you a little more in depth. Not so much in this case, but at least they give you the dates as to when it is effective. Okay. Gotta close that. Okay. I assume everyone can see my screen here with the slides. I'm just going to go through it like this. So our agenda for today, I got to keep moving because actually it takes a while to get through these, but we're going to go through those four categories that we just went through in the data dictionary. Then we're going to take a deeper dive, more in-depth look at closely associated and critical function, what those two terms mean. Look at the distinction between critical function and closely associated, and then look at a catch-all category, which is what I'm calling a catch-all, wastebasket category, other. And we'll do a recap, and then I'll get into more about who I am, what the Fed Data Check product is, and Potomac Wave. That's the same. We go through that a lot, the same virtually every week. So if you haven't heard it, you're welcome to stay on. If you have heard it, you're welcome to drop off. Okay. So what we're doing on fed data check. So we have, for a quick overview, we have 11 agencies subscribed to our product, and one of the things it does is automatically spot logical inconsistencies in an FPDS&G transaction. An example on that would be you got more than one offer on the award, and yet it's coded as a not competed award. 99.9% of the time, that would be a logical inconsistency. The competition section says it's not competed. Number of offers says it is. So in this case, this check was recommended to us or requested to us by one of our subscribers, the Treasury, Department of the Treasury. And here is what this data check is doing. If the product or service code designates that the award is predominantly for a product, begins with a number, and if the FPDS&G data field has one of those four values in it, CL, CT, closely associated, critical, other, or a combination, then that transaction, that data is in an inconsistent state. Put more simply, if the PSC code is for a product, then the IGF code should simply be left blank. Now that's not exactly what the data dictionary said, as we saw, which was FPDS&G is requiring that that new field be filled out if it is for a service. They don't say anything if it's for a product. Let's take a look at some examples where, here's an example where the data in FPDS&G, the transaction, is clearly in an inconsistent state because of this rule. And if you have a question or comment, or if you disagree, raise your hand. Okay, so here's a FY19 award by the Justice Department, Federal Bureau of Prisons, BOP. Let's take a look at it. It's not above the SAT. There's the vendor, Federal Prison Industries, Inc. And let's come down and see, first of all, let's look at the inherently governmental function. They have it both, closely associated and critical. That's kind of the, one of the most designated as a very, they're all important, but this would be a particularly important service contract if it was for a service. Okay, what did they buy for this? So they're saying it's closely associated, as we'll see, with an inherently governmental function, and it's critical for the Bureau of Prisons to maintain its mission. So they're buying dairy foods and eggs. This BPA is for products including various milk, flavored beverages, water, and butter. Okay, that's not related to a, as we'll see, as a closely associated function, a closely associated service being performed by a contractor to the federal government. It's also not in any way related to a critical function. It's not a service. It's not an activity. I mean, sure, I mean, having prisoners have milk and water and butter, that's critical. But as we'll see in the definition, if you're the vendor supplying the meals to the prisoners, and as well as these other products, then that can be considered critical. That would be a service you're performing for BOP. That would be in a critical area. But simply buying a product is not what this definition is going after, as we'll see, and as I think is kind of evident on its face. So why is this inconsistent? To beat this to death here, the PSC code begins with a number. The IGF does have a coding in it. It was not left blank. That's an error. That's a data inconsistency. Now let's take a look at this one. Here's one that's not as obvious. Okay, there's the vendor, G-Star Telecom. The IGF coding is an other function, so it does have one. They're saying it is, it's not closely associated service / function. It's not a critical function / service, but it is an other. It is, but they did buy a product. It's predominantly for a product, but look at the contract description. Auditorium upgrade supplies, equipment, maintenance, and services. So it's a mix of products and services. The predominant spend is for a product, but there is a services CLIN or services mix in with this award. So that gets me to the first poll of the day. Let's see. Let me see what you think. Okay, let's see. Distributing poll. This should be coming up. There we go. Do you think our data check is correct? If it's for a product, even if it's a mix, just leave it blank. Don't fill it in. Not only is it not recommended, as will we, Treasury, the Security Exchange Commission, and to some degree Department of Interior have determined that it's wrong to fill it in. We'll let the poll go on here for a few more minutes, actually a few more seconds. Okay. All right. So 3/4 of you said that yes, that concept is valid. How about seeing my screen? Kathleen, can you see my screen?
Yep, I can see your PowerPoint. You're on.
Okay, good. All right, so 3/4 of you agreed with this check, 1/4 of you did not. Okay, let's get into why. Why do we think in both cases we looked at it was wrong? We went through the data dictionary, which did emphasize the service aspect of that data field. Here is an observation of a Securities and Exchange Acquisition Oversight official. The 6T IGF field is only for services because it's hypothetically, if coding compliance increases, an input for the service contract inventory and service contract reporting, which are only applicable when the primary intent of the contract is for purchasing services. So that's a big one. And I actually have some more information on that I'll send out. Let's see if I got it here. This is from a policy, OFPP policy letter. This insight, the IGF coding, is especially important for contract whose performance may involve critical functions or functions close. They're talking about service contract inventory reporting. Now, especially important for contract whose performance may involve critical functions or functions closely associated with inherently governmental functions, as may be the case for example, with contracts for various professional, administrative, and management services falling within the code of R. So that'd be management support, things like that. So really the tie-in for 6T, the importance of it is as it relates to service contract inventory reporting. Service contract inventory reporting is only for awards that are predominantly for services. That's the main argument for not putting it in if it's a product. You're out of sync, out of line with the thrust of why this is being done. Here's what Treasury's position. For Treasury, our policy is only to require service coding paperwork to be completed for acquisitions where the predominant amount is for services. We ran it by Interior, and in the example we showed them, they agreed that it should have been left blank. So at least in an anecdotal case, they also would like to see it left blank. But there is no known FAR reference that prohibits the assigning for an IGF code when an award was predominantly for supplies but also included services. Okay, so let's look at let's move on here. Here we go, Denise. Good question. We're going to get into that in terms of how we actually allocate what code to use for what particular service. Okay. So why, the big picture, 30,000 foot view, why are we doing this? When you put down in that IGF field, that 6T, inherently governmental field, you put down that it's CL, closely associated. What in effect you're doing is you're throwing a yellow flag to yourself and your colleagues saying, we have to guard against encroachment. We have to be, but it's okay to have a closely associated function performed by contractors, but we have to be doubly aware that these contractors' activities don't cross the line into an activity that should only be done by a federal employee. Encroachment, crossing the line, dump the fence. Okay. Another thing you're doing with this 6T field, if you put down critical function, CT, you're throwing a yellow flag to yourself, others, your colleagues, the SCI, people doing the SCI inventory saying, we have to be doubly sure in this area that we're not becoming over-reliant on contractors. And therefore, if the contractor defaults, the mission of our agency is now in trouble. And as we'll see, there is nothing wrong with, you might even say encouraged, to have contractors do closely associated functions, to have contractors do critical functions, but there's extra vigilance that needs to be done when that is the case. And then a signal flare, as we just saw, to the service contract inventory reporting to review that award in their end of the year report to OFPP. Okay, let's keep going here. And why don't I see if I can get this a little bit bigger. Let's see. I need to switch my screen here. How about let's see. Well, I need to go back to this way. Kathleen, can you still see can you see where I've highlighted critical functions here? Am I on the right screen?
No, you're on the email screen. You had it right for a second.
Okay. Well, let's go back to Brian, you got a second? There we go. How about now, Kathleen? Critical function screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right. I'm good. All right. So the key, all of these definitions go off of this Federal Register document, which I've hyperlinked here. So here's the Federal Register document, and let's open up the PDF. And this is what this webinar is based on. It's a lengthy document, 16 pages, but it's the authoritative source. What is an IGF? What is an inherently governmental function? This Federal Register document says it reaffirms that there's a single definition of this term, and it's what is based in the FAIR Act. Okay, so then what does it say in the FAIR Act? Federal Activities Inventory Reform Act of 1998. Means a function that is so intimately related to the public interest as to require performance by federal employees, government employees, such as to bind the United States to take or not take some action by contract, policy, regulation, authorization, order, or otherwise. If you scroll to the bottom of this Federal Register document, they also give a list in the appendix, Appendix A, of inherently governmental functions. Examples of inherently governmental functions: the direction or conduct of criminal investigation. How about this? The selection or non-selection of individuals for federal government employment, direct control of federal employees, the determination of budget policy, guidance, and strategy. And in another section of here, they make the awarding of contracts, the decision as to which vendor gets a contract award. So if you think about it, another way to look at this, as I look at it, is an IGF is what does the public expect in terms of that activity, so that every citizen is treated in a fair and impartial manner. You know, if you're being, obviously, I think they have sentenced to prison up here too. Well, they talk about criminal investigation. And in another area, I'm having trouble finding it. You can take a look at prosecutions. If you as a citizen, as just someone who's not a federal employee, and someone out there is making a decision as to whether to charge you with a crime, you don't want Booz Allen and Hamilton making that decision. You want a federal employee who's looking at it just from, who's performing their role strictly in the interest of the federal government and the public. Booz Allen, as great of a company that is, with a great, I'm sure they're fine people, but hey, if you're going to get charged with a crime, did they have a financial incentive to charge more people with crimes? I mean, all sorts of things would run through your head. Okay, so that's an inherently governmental function. In terms of, they also have a table in there that we'll see as it relates to acquisition-related activities. So if in terms of having the statement of work approved and published to FedBizOpps, the public expects that to be under the discretion and under the control of a federal employee, to be fair, particularly if it's a recompete. Now, can a contractor or a support personnel, can they provide input into that process, a draft statement of work for review? Sure, you can do that, but that would be another example of the public expecting impartial, fair, unbiased treatment. IGF. Critical associate. What's the definition of a critical associated function? Well, as we saw in the data dictionary, there isn't one. Okay, what does the Federal Register say? There is no definition in the Federal Register either. They do provide this. OFP does not believe a definition of closely associated function will necessarily provide greater clarity, but has created a new checklist. So we went through Appendix A in this Federal Register, which gives you examples of inherently governmental functions. And in example B, they give examples of closely associated functions. Let's take a look at this one. Disseminators, services in support of inherently governmental functions, including but not limited to performing budget preparation activities such as workload modeling, fact-finding, efficiency studies, and cost analysis. Here's another one. It gets you in line of a closely associated function. Supporting acquisition, including in the areas of acquisition planning, conducting market research, draft statements of work. So they don't provide a definition, but they give a checklist. So here's my definition. Here's the one I came up with. Let's see now, people in here with a lot of experience, and feel free. This has gone over well in our last webinar, but let's see if someone else can improve on it. Raise your hand. A closely associated function must be in the general ballpark of an inherently governmental function, but is not encroached past the fence line. And here's the quote from the Federal Register. In the case of closely associated functions, the agency is trying to prevent contractor performance from interfering with federal employees' ability to perform IGFs. So when you label a service as being closely associated to an IGF, you're throwing that yellow flag. You're subliminally, you're virtually raising a fence saying, contractors, you're close to performing an inherently governmental function, but we're not going to let you cross the line to the point to where the public can perceive to be a bias, perceive to be unfairness, would question what the federal government is doing. Now, what I want to do is I want to go up to this table they have up here, which lays it out between, here's the function. This is what can only be performed by federal employees. Here's work that is closely associated to that, but can be done by a federal employee or contractor. Acquisition, determination of requirements, statement of work, approval of contract strategy, statement of work. These are federal employee only tasks. Determination of price reasonableness, awarding contracts. Only a Fed can do that. All right, but we know that contractors are in this general ballpark. So what can contractors do? They can draft a statement of work. You can have a federal employee do that or a contractor do that. You can prepare a technical evaluation. So in other words, they talk about this. A contractor can sit on a source selection board as a technical advisor or as a non-voting member. Assist in evaluating, so here's one thing, a contractor can assist in the evaluation of another contractor's performance. So, that contractor could come up with a template to say, look, example that we discussed last week, happened to be a simple one to think about, is housekeeping. Say, look, here's our template. How many slips were there on the floor? How did the bathrooms look like in terms of being well stocked? Cafeteria after closing. So here's the contractor could come up with a checklist as to what the evaluators can the federal evaluators, CPAR's evaluators should be looking at. And they could even presumably go through that checklist for certain vendors. But looking it over, approving it, validating it, saying, yep, I agree with, and modifying it, that the final hurdle on that has got to be done by a Fed. So what's the common theme there on closely associated? Is the work has to be within shouting distance, within the ballpark of an IGF. Let's take a look at an example here. Okay. Let's go back here. Any trouble seeing my screen, or if I'm clicking too fast? Sometimes if I click too fast, I'm talking and the screen sharing is not caught up yet. But here's a good closely associated example. EPA, Tetra Tech is the vendor. They classified this as a closely associated function. This should be FY19. I only picked FY19 examples. Yep. Okay, what are they doing? They're doing professional support. And remember, this was an EPA award. No, actually, that's not significant. But stream and lake monitoring, networks assistance, and IDF curve development for BMPs. So if we're going to read into this, reading into this more than what this transaction says, imagine that if this stream or lake becomes over the line in terms of too much pollution, EPA then issues I'm really making this up, a call to the local factories and towns that they have to cut back on their hours, their runoff or whatever. Okay, well that would be for that authority, that has to come from a federal official. But this contractor could be working in that area and making recommendations and data to support that IGF task. I'm saying, hey, we're now over the line. The lake's too polluted. No more fertilizer on the public parks till further notice. So we did look at an example in FPDS&G of a closely associated function, or we read into one, that one we just looked at. Let's look into FPDS&G for an award to a contractor performing an inherently governmental function. Now, of course, the answer to that is there better not be one. I can't find an example in FPDS&G, hopefully, where a contractor is doing something that stepped over the line so that the public didn't have confidence in the federal government decision making. Okay, so we've gone through two. One of the question was, one of the things is that, can we get to that web address that you're referencing? You're talking about that, Denise, I think you're referring to the Federal Register document. And that's going to be, I'll send the Federal Register document, and it's also linked in the PowerPoint notes that PowerPoint deck that I'm using. Okay. Okay, we've gone through two, IGF, CL. How about a critical? That is defined in the Federal Register. Necessary to the agency being able to effectively perform and maintain control of its mission. And as we'll also see, since agencies have different missions, services that are critical to one agency may not be critical to another. Talking about critical now. So if you think of critical, this is they're doing services that are in support, that are critical, important, essential to the agency being able to fulfill its mission. And here's one. A critical function may or may not be in any way related to an inherently governmental function. They're not necessarily related. Hence, there's two categories, closely associated, critical. Here's a hypothetical example. The President of the United States, protecting the President of the United States is a critical function of the United States Secret Service, one of their core missions. I know another one happens to be counterfeiting, stopping counterfeiting of money. And the enabling of communications between Secret Service agents is an activity function that supports that critical function. You know, you see these, it's on TV, right? You see the Secret Service agents with the earbuds in their ear where they can communicate with each other. So, an award to a vendor to supply that communications ability to enable those Secret Service agents to talk to each other when they're in the field. And if that award was carried out according to precise requirements of the federal government and under the close oversight of federal employees, then that is a critical function. That is an award that should be designated as a critical function, but it's not a closely associated. Okay, so let's think about that just for a second. Does the public, is it their expectation that the federal government will be developing telecommunications capability? Well, no. I mean, no one in the public expects the federal government, you know, they can buy from Sprint, T-Mobile, whatever other ones are out there, AT&T, whoever supplies this, you know, that supplying of telecommunications capability is something that everyone would expect is done by the private sector. So there's nothing in the nature of the work that would lead the public to think that this contractor has an unfair advantage and the system is rigged in favor of one vendor versus another. Then I did throw in this other part. The requirements were precise, and the contractor was working under the close and direct oversight of federal employees. So in other words, their discretion is low. The vendors brought in to supply telecommunications capability. They have a precise checklist to go through. The requirements are clear. We want you to do A, B, and C by this date. Not much discretion. All of that points to the nature of the function and the amount of discretion that the vendor has, in this case, which is minimal, points to it being a critical function and not a closely associated function. Let's look at an example. Another EPA one. These just I didn't pick these for any particular group. Tetra Tech again. Wait a minute. Did I get the wrong? That wasn't the right one. I didn't copy that. It's not EPA. This should be a Department of Justice award. FY19, not a lot of money. But AT&T Corp, critical function. It is a service, architect and engineering, construction of penal facilities. So AT&T is providing long-distance service to the command center, the Bureau of Prisons Command Center. Nature of the work, you know, they're not. The nature of the work does not involve deciding what vendor gets an award. The nature of the work is not deciding who goes to prison and who doesn't, who gets charged with a crime, who doesn't, what federal employees get hired, which ones don't, so on. So there's nothing in the nature of the work that says it's an IGF. And again, reading into it, presumably the Bureau of Prisons and the people in charge say, look, we need We need these many phone lines. We need to make sure that it's always up. We need this level of redundancy. We need screens to know who to call. I mean, on and on and on. I mean, it seems like it would be a closely dictated requirements to AT&T to fulfill this function. And obviously, it's critical. You got to have a command center in case something really goes wrong, and be able to communicate with people, to be able to maintain control of your mission. In this case, Bureau of Prisons maintaining control of those prisons. So it's critical by nature of the work, and it's not closely associated by the nature of the work and the amount of discretion presumably given to the vendor. All right, how about another function? So we've gone through the big three: IGF, closely associated, critical. What's another? If you look in that, one of the things they talk about in the Federal Register is determining the statement of work, finalizing that and publishing it. That's a Fed. Coming up with a draft statement of work, that's closely associated. What's another? Making sure the statement of work gets put in the contract file. That seemed like a good example to me. You know, clerical support. That's not saying it's not important. I mean, if it wasn't important and it wasn't necessary, it wouldn't be done. But dang nabbit. Okay. Let's take a look at this one for an other. Justice FY19 award. It is a service. What are they doing? They're making award ceremony devices for the office director. So someone's getting a coin, someone's getting a plaque. Let's assume that the ship's hatch. So, you know, is making a commemorative plaque. Is that something? Obviously, it's not an IGF. It's not something close to what a federal employee has to be doing, and it's not critical. You know, the Marshal Service can keep track of whatever they do. Prisoners, is that people in awaiting trial? You know, they can do that without having a ceremony, but it's obviously good for morale, and so that would be an example where an obvious other function, because it doesn't, and that's where I think the method should go through here is, hey, is this within a shouting distance of an IGF? No. Is it critical? You know, if this contractor, let's assume this contractor defaulted, went away, we never did get those ceremony plaques. You know, would our core mission be affected? Would prisoners not be watched over and escorted to the courthouse? No, we could still do that. Okay, well, then since you've eliminated the first two, and since the award is for a service, you have one choice left. It's got to be other. I've been going on now for about 45 minutes. Is any comments, questions? Someone not like my definitions? Someone have definitions that they use? See if I got another poll here. How about this? Let's try this. This is my, you know, again, the Federal Register did not come up, said, look, since they're closely associated, you know, we were going to give you a checklist, but we're not going to provide a paragraph English definition of it. What do you think of my general one? Someone doesn't like it. We'll go for another few seconds. Okay. So virtually everyone liked that concept. If someone who said no, maybe that was a misclick, but if you wanted to raise your hand and say why you disagree with that, that would be helpful. Okay. All right, let's do a deep dive into closely associated. We talked about that. What is, we've touched on it, but that's one of the big key points of this. How do you code these things? CL is joined at the hip to an IGF within shouting distance in the ballpark. If it is not at least somewhat related to an IGF, it cannot be considered CL. Here's another thing directly out of a quote, directly out of the Federal Register. Functions associated with inherently governmental functions and critical functions are often performed by both federal employees and contractors. So that's not bad. You know, if you're making, if you're looking at this activity, making commemorative plaques, or you're looking at, I don't want to pick on housekeeping. Everyone likes walking into nice buildings. It's a great morale booster, but how many federal employees are doing that? So the answer is if no federal employees are doing it, then I would say you're looking at another function, not a closely associated one. It's another indicator. What is the purpose of labeling an award a CL, closely associated? The agency, and this is right out of the Federal Register, the agency is trying to prevent contractor performance from interfering with federal employees' ability to perform IGFs. If a contractor is deciding what federal employee, ridiculously, what federal employee gets promoted, which one doesn't, who gets hired, who doesn't, hey, well then, if I'm the senior procurement executive, you're interfering with me to be able to control my workforce. An award should be coded as CL if activities that are performed in direct support of IGFs, the activities are performed in direct support. Analysis of feasibility studies to support the development of policy. Approval of that policy, federal, that employee. Analysis, feasibility, information, market research, input into the development of policy, closely associated. If, in contrast, contractors are inappropriately performing IGFs if they, quote, are involved in making binding decisions, the final shape of a policy, which are inherently governmental. An IGF function, final determination of requirements, the SAL, that's an IGF, closely associated, drafting statements of work and other pre-award documents. Critical function, development of an IT system that merges contract writing system data, FPDS&G, CPARS, SAM, and financial payments to include a searchable text box for statement of work. So they can say, look, I'm developing a new solicitation. I want to see what's been done similarly in this past, see if I can reuse some of it. If an IT system is supporting that, then that would be critical. It's not closely associated. The government, public does development of an IT system. I would say, generally speaking, is the public would expect that more on the private sector side than the others. Not totally. There's certainly federal employees involved in that work as well. I've personally met them. I know at Department of Homeland Security. But public wouldn't be shocked if an IT system is being developed by private sector contractors. Close state requirements under close supervision of federal employee project managers, then that would be critical. by nature and by the amount of discretion, the contractor is not within shouting distance of an IGF. Other function, make sure the statement of work and other acquisition documents are accounted for and accurately placed in the contract file. Two main tests, IGF versus CL, closely associated. And this is straight out of the Federal Register. Nature of the functions. Functions which involve the exercise of sovereign powers of the United States are governmental by their nature. Examples of functions that by their nature are IGF are officially representing the United States in an intergovernmental form or body, arresting a person, sentencing a person convicted of a crime to prison. Sovereign power. Discretion. A function requiring the exercise of discretion shall be deemed inherently governmental if that exercise of that discretion commits the government to a course of action where two or more alternative courses of action exist, and decision-making is not already limited or guided by existing policies, procedures, directions, and orders. Making a award to a vendor to develop an IT system. Well, you're committing the government to a course of action, so that's IGF. You sat in on the evaluation board as a non-voting member and provided some price analysis for federal employee review. Well, that would be a CL. Didn't commit the government to anything. It supported the decision of federal employees to commit the government to something. All right. Any more polls here? I got one more at the end. I'm open to comments and questions. We're getting close to the end. No? Okay. Critical. A function that is not in the ballpark of an IGF and does not involve significant discretion, but is critical in support of an agency's mission should be coded CT. And this is right out of the Federal Register here. A function, this isn't, but the next quote is, a function that is critical for one agency may not be for a different agency. Determining the criticality of a function depends on the missions and operations, which will differ between agencies and within agencies over time. So what exactly is it then? What is it critical? A function that is necessary to the agency being able to effectively perform and maintain control of its missions and operations. And here's the key test. Here's the best way to look at it. That's my statement. What would happen if you were head of the agency or in a, or in a key oversight role? What if a contractor defaulted? Contractors are terminated for cause and default all the time. Not all, a couple hundred times a year, I would say, or it happens. What if that contractor were to default? What would happen to your agency? So here is an example. I think I get into this next one. We'll elaborate on that, I think, on the next one here. Well, let me talk about that now. So the example that we discussed last week was animal control. I did work as a contractor at the Department of State in an annex down there in Foggy Bottom. There was a mouse problem in the building, so they brought in animal control to try to get rid of that, solve that problem. Now, what if that contractor defaulted, did a poor job, didn't execute, mice didn't go down, they didn't meet their deadlines, they were terminated for, well, I forget which one, either cause or default. Would the Department of State, would their diplomacy come to an end? Or would it be severely impacted? Would treaties not get signed? Would ambassador? Well, of course not. be ridiculous. The core mission of the Department of State would not have been affected upon default of that contractor for animal control / rodent control at a State Department annex. But if you flip that to an animal control vendor for the Federal Aviation Administration, so you're at an airport, you're hiring a vendor for animal control. Let's say that there are no federal employees directly involved working the animal control. You have less experienced specialists overseeing that contract, and the vendor messes up. The vendor defaults, does not do what they say they're going to do. What happens then? Well, you could have large animals in the runway, deer in the runway. You could have groundhogs messing up the runways as well. You could have flocks of geese. All sorts of bad things could happen with a vendor for animal control defaulting at an airport, and you combine that with there are no federal employees doing that job, and there's not expert contract oversight. So in that case, it's the same type of service, but in one case, it's an other function, and in the FAA, it would be a critical. So that's the best test, is the over-reliance test. You're trying to prevent the whole reason that you're putting CT. Well, okay, so then you're the contractor. You say, hey, look, that's a CT, animal support at an airport with the FAA. So that means, hey, look, we got to have some federal employees and directly involved in that activity, probably. Or at a minimum, we better have our top flight contracting, seasoned, high-level warrant officers who can quickly know the market and bring in a replacement vendor on a non-competitive basis if this person defaults. That's why they say here is that you may be able to address over-reliance on contractors by allocation of additional resources to contract management. You got a fallback plan to award a contract non-competitively as an interim gap should a default occur. That could be a way around it. So long as agencies have the internal capacity needed to maintain control over their operations, they are permitted to allow contractor performance of positions within critical functions. Nothing wrong with having a contractor do animal control if you're Federal Aviation Administration, but you need federal employees, or at a bare minimum, expert acquisition oversight to be able to recover from a default. Examples of a closely associated function, a CL function that is not a critical function. How about this? Drafting a statement of work for contract for housekeeping services for DHS's headquarters. It's closely associated because a federal employee can only approve a statement of work. It's an input into that function within the ballpark of an IGF. But if housekeeping defaulted, that would be a problem. But it would not impact DHS being able to carry out its mission. Example of a critical function that is not closely associated. So a CT that's not a CL. Modification of DHS's contract writing system to allow for the coding of the new FPDS&G data field 6T. Acme IT contractor, look, we need a new data field. We need to be able to accept these 4 values. We need you to be able to interface with FPDS&G when it's finalized. Okay, well that's critical. We need to get that. We need to be able to interact with FPDS&G, and that from an acquisition perspective. But there's no, by nature of the work and by the level of discretion, it's critical, not closely associated. How about both? You can't have both. Let's look at this example. So it can be closely associated and critical. So this is a pretty good dollar value award, over $1 million. Fluor Enterprises. Closely associated and critical. So they've tagged it both. It's within shouting distance of an IGF, and they got to have this done properly for the agency's mission to be fulfilled. Who's it for? FEMA. Okay, what is Fluor doing? Architect and engineering. It is a service. It's for technical specialists in support of FEMA Region 4, Georgia. I think that was probably because of the hurricane. But let's theorize. It was for that hurricane who recently came through the southeast. These specialists are architect and engineering. Maybe they have input into what buildings must come down, how to rebuild buildings to better withstand hurricanes. So they're making decisions in terms of policy and regulations regarding building codes, theoretically. They're not making the final decision, but they have important input into it. And it's obviously this buildings architect, tearing down, reconstruction, building codes. That's FEMA's part of FEMA's core mission. So that would be closely associated and critical as I read into it. The other function, the best way to look at this is it's the wastebasket collector. It's the catch-all. If you go through your checklist on whether it's CL or not, you can read the checklist. Think about if it's close to the line to a federal employee's job. Critical, what happens if they defaulted? If it's not one of those two, then just, there is no, you don't have to think about what another function is. It's got to be. You don't have any other choice. Again, but this is presuming that the award is predominantly for a service. PSC code begins with a letter. Here would be another example that I came up with: manufacturing of commemorative coins for the Department of State. You see those, people have them on their desks, federal employees, the accomplishment of a mission or a new activity within a department. You might get a coin. Okay, that would be another. If you're manufacturing a precious metal commemorative coins by the U.S. Mint, okay, well, that would not be another. That would be a critical. That's part of their core job. All right, let's do one more here, and then we'll wrap it up. The other key point as to why we're doing all this, and there's also another field that we're going to be reviewing in the weeks ahead, which is the additional reporting, which has service contract inventory as one of the choices there. But is your agency plan to use this new field 6T? And let's say next week when we get into it, I think it's 7G, additional reporting. Those are going to be inputs into your end of year service contract inventory analysis. Well, I'm getting about 50-50 on this one. About 50-50. Okay. Well, most of you said no, you're not going to use it for your input into SCI. Kathleen, am I back on screen? Hopefully everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, you are. Sorry.
All right. Okay, one thing to keep in mind is functions versus activities. OFP has added a caveat to recognize that many functions include multiple activities, some of which may not be inherently governmental. So in other words, a function can be broken down into many separate activities. These other activities performed in conjunction with the function may be closely associated or neither inherently governmental nor closely associated. So it's just something to take a look at. One activity or more rolls up into a function based on this Federal Register terminology. Okay, review. What are we saying? We have Fed Data Check is a product put out by Potomac Wave. We have 11 agencies subscribing to our product, such as, here they are here, Education, HHS, SEC, others. What is the decision we've made? If it's a product, PSC code begins with a number, leave it blank. Yes, you could put it in, but it's wrong to. Leave it blank. A CL, it's got to be within a ballpark of an IGF. Use the 2 tests in 76 in the Federal Register. Does the public expect, by the nature of the work, sentencing someone to prison, going to war, making a policy, is the public expectation that a federal employee is going to make that call to keep things on the level? The answer to that is yes, and particularly that, and if you combine that with, that's an inherently governmental. Is the function within the ballpark of that, somewhere supporting that activity, within shouting distance? Okay, that's one indicator. And the other indicator, is there discretion afforded the vendor? I talked about that monitoring of streams for pollution. Okay, maybe the vendor could say, look, this isn't polluted at all. We're not going to come back for a month. This one looks a little suspicious. We're going to come back every 2 days. So you're leaving it up to the vendor's discretion as to how often they monitor the lakes and stream, what tests they use. Okay, well, now you're getting into a closely associated function, given the discretion, nature of the work, what it's supporting. Critical function, but the easy test there, which I think really keeps it straightforward, imagine in your head if the vendor defaulted. Would you really be in trouble with your mission or not? The answer is yes, it's a critical function. Other function, process of elimination. If it's not in the first 2, it's another. And a function is comprised of activities. Some of those activities may be IGF and fall into different areas. So it's, I guess, really what we're saying there is, there is a lot of judgment involved in where to slot these things. That's it. I'm going to go through who I am and who Potomac Wave is and what Fed Data Check is. If you're interested in that, you could stay on. I would like to get comments and questions. Someone's got to have a comment out here as to what you're doing or something you thought we could have explained better or refined more on our presentation. We've got to have one comment. Somebody raise their hand. Let's see here. Oh, hey, great. Denise, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. What do you think? What are your thoughts on this whole? What are we going to think?
I'm still a little confused because the whole reason why I came to this webinar is because I received these inherently governmental function forms, and it's like a checklist that we have to do. And I understood when you were talking about the different definitions and, but I don't know, just trying to implement what I've learned now into doing the checklist. I'm still a little confused because I know you said you're trying to prevent the contractor performance from interfering with federal employees' ability to perform IGF.
Right.
But it's just, looking at it, it just looks like Greek when you actually look at the function, when you look at the checklist that you have to do. Because before we just put a blurb in the acquisition plan.
What would that blurb have?
It'll just say, like, in other words, the contractors will not be performing any inherently governmental functions.
Right.
Just like a sentence or two.
Let's, incidentally, this came up in the last, here is the, and let's do it for, this is our Excel interface into FPDS and G data. We're only looking at civilian data. So this does not count DOD, but so these are, we've had in FY19, and these could be FSSs, so we should get rid of that. Remember, FSSs are GWACs. Do not, I'm going somewhere with this. Let me get this down to FSSs and GWACs. Take those out. Come on, here we go. And this is going to get to your point.
Okay.
Okay, so this is, I don't know how those, it's because they're not mod 0. Let's do mod 0. We're going to look at new awards in FY19 that are for service. I'm not including FSSs or GWACs. And that's the breakout of those 4 buckets. Now let's look at this at a percentage basis. 82% are in other. So if you look at all the new service awards in FY19 for the civilian agencies, 82% are going into other, 8% closely associated, 7% into critical. So what someone said yesterday, I'm not going to say who, and I actually forgot who the person was, but they said, you know, we were told just to put other. Forget all that stuff. Just if it's good service, just put OT. We don't know what all this other stuff is either. So it's kind of, I don't know if everyone's doing that, but based on the level of instruction and you know, the data dictionary is not going to help you out. It is interesting that more than 8 out of the 10 awards are going into the catch-all basin, which I think is sort of along the lines of what you're saying. It's a confusing, still a confusing area and not easy to figure out which one to pick. Martha, did you have a comment? Martha? No?
Jackie, you made me do that.
Okay. Martha, I sort of heard that. If that was you, if you could say it again. No? All right. We'll put you back on mute. Anyway, so that was that. Denise, thank you for that. And
Thank you.
I'm going to send out the slides and the Federal Register notice tomorrow. So if you want to stay on about who we are, that's coming up next. So I can go to, let's see here. I can never do it this way. I'll just stick on this. I'm Bob Harford, VP Business Intelligence Products with Potomac Wave Consulting. Fed Data Check. If you go to YouTube and type in Fed Data Check, the best thing is our YouTube channel. You can click on one of our videos and see what we're all about. What we're doing is we're improving procurement metrics. One of the examples is we're catching awards that are improperly coded as an IGF with an IGF code. We make sure that in the awards adhere to the Trade Agreement Act and the Buy American Act. If they fall outside of that, for example, if you buy ammunition, small arms ammunition outside the United States, that would be a violation of the Buy American Act, and we would flag it, send you an email. So there's two examples. We also, additionally, we support competitive one-bid analysis. Why are certain awards competed and only receiving one offer? That's another area of focus of ours. And interestingly, and one other last one I'll mention is integration with SAM. So we do see things such as awards being made to debarred vendors. It can often happen if they're debarred within the debarment, and the award is made within 2 days of each other, so they can overlap. You can get CLP points for attending this webinar. I'm going to send out a training certificate tomorrow. We were founded in 2007. Women-owned small business, mostly. Outgrown it in some NAICS codes. Fed Data Check as a product has been out for 5 years. Here's some of the things we do. Here's our subscribing agencies. Phantom 8A awards, that's another one. A lot of the 8A awards are underreported in FPDS&G because the type of set-aside field is not set accurately. And that's it. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Keep an eye out. In 2 weeks, we're going to be doing it on the other new field, 7G, additional reporting, because that has a tie into the SCI. All right, let's see. That web address I was referencing, I did have that. You can. It's in my PowerPoint deck. And it is... let's see, if you Google FR56227, let's see what happens when you do that. So if I Google 26 FR56227, it takes you right to it. It'll be right there. So 76 space Federal Register FR space 56227, and then you click on that. And then it gives you the PDF. You click on the PDF, and then there it is. OFPP policy letter 1101, performance of inherently governmental and critical functions. And I will put that in here right now. When am I do that? How about that there? I did say you can get CLP points, Gary. So I send you a certificate, and then you could submit that to FATAS. But whether your FATAS administrator, right, or whoever's overseeing FATAS approves it or not is up to them. We don't do that. But some agencies will automatically approve a Fed Data Check CLP, which are NOAA, NIST, Interior, Fish and Wildlife, SEC, Education, and Treasury. You do have to, we don't give it, if someone comes on for 5 minutes and then leaves, we don't do a training certificate on that. So you do have to meet a minimum time attendance and interest rating, they call. All right, hey, thanks everyone. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully that was helpful. See ya. I'll hang on for a little while if anyone has any comments at the end.